The clock on the wall of the emergency room read 2:17 in the morning when the doctors stopped counting. There was no dramatic announcement, no moment of loud grief, just a slow, terrible stillness that crept into every corner of that room like cold air seeping through a broken window. The machines that had been beeping and humming and fighting alongside the medical team for the past 30 minutes had gone quiet, one by one, until the silence was so complete that it felt almost solid, like something you could press your hand against and feel pushing back. It was the kind of silence that does not exist in ordinary life. It only lives in places where hope has already packed its bags and walked out the door without saying goodbye. A father stood against the wall. His name was Ethan Whitmore, and he was a man who built a technology company from nothing, a man who negotiated contracts worth millions, a man who had faced boardrooms full of skeptical investors and walked out victorious every single time. But tonight, in this fluorescent-lit room that smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation, he was just a father. His overcoat was soaked through from the rain outside. His hair was plastered to his forehead. His hands, which had signed so many important documents and shaken so many important hands, were now hanging limp at his sides, trembling slightly, completely useless. On the hospital bed in front of him lay his 18-month-old daughter, Lily. She was so small. She looked like a doll someone had placed there, her tiny chest still, her pink blanket pulled up around her, her face pale and perfect and heartbreakingly quiet. The lead physician stepped back from the bed. He was a senior doctor, a man who had spent decades in emergency medicine, a man who had seen things that would have broken most people, and he had not broken. But tonight, his shoulders curved inward just slightly, the way shoulders do when the body absorbs a weight the heart cannot carry alone. He lowered his head. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said the 4 words that no parent should ever have to hear. "We've done everything we can." A nurse quietly pulled off her gloves. Another reached for the monitor to silence it permanently. Someone in the corner of the room let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for a very long time. Ethan's knees buckled. He caught himself against the wall, his fingers pressing into the cold painted surface, and he made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry. It was something in between, something that came from a place inside him he had never visited before and desperately wished he never had to visit. His daughter. His Lily, the little girl who laughed at everything, who reached for his face with both hands every morning when he lifted her from her crib, who had a habit of falling asleep with one fist pressed against her cheek, like she was thinking very hard about something important even in her dreams. She had been found unconscious after choking silently on her bottle. By the time anyone realized, too much time had already passed. He had driven to the hospital with his foot pressed all the way down on the accelerator and his heart somewhere in his throat. And now here he was, and it was 2:17 in the morning, and the doctors had stopped. Nobody noticed the boy standing in the doorway. He was barefoot. His feet were slightly blue from the cold of the hospital floor. His hoodie was torn at both sleeves, fraying at the cuffs, and his jeans were stained with the kind of dust that comes from sleeping in places that were not designed for sleeping. He looked no older than 12, maybe younger if you focused on the softness still left in his face, though his eyes were older. The kind of eyes that have spent a long time paying careful attention to a world that was not always kind. In his hands he held a backpack, faded blue, held together in 2 places with strips of duct tape, sagging with the weight of the few things inside it that he considered worth carrying. His name was Noah Carter, and nobody in that room knew he was there. For nearly a year, Noah had been living between temporary shelters on the south side of the city. His mother had passed away 2 years before from an illness that arrived quietly and moved quickly. And before that, his father had already been gone. Gone in the way some fathers go, not with a funeral or a goodbye, just with an absence that grows larger every day until it fills the entire room. Noah had learned to carry those absences the way you learn to carry a heavy bag, not because it gets lighter, but because your shoulders eventually adjust. Most mornings began the same way. He woke up before the other shelter residents, folded the blanket he had slept under with the same careful precision every time, packed his backpack, and walked. He walked until the city woke up around him, until the bakeries turned on their lights and the buses started running, and the world filled again with noise and movement and the ordinary business of people going somewhere. Inside his backpack were 4 things that he never let go of: 2 clean t-shirts he washed in shelter bathrooms and dried on railings, a photograph of his older brother who had moved away before everything fell apart, a flashlight with batteries that were slowly dying, and a first aid handbook worn so soft from handling that the cover had separated from the spine and was now held on with a rubber band. That book was everything to him. 3 years earlier, at a family picnic on a warm Sunday afternoon, Noah had watched his younger cousin begin to choke. One moment she was laughing, reaching for another piece of watermelon, and the next she was silent, her face changing color, her small hands going to her throat. The adults around her panicked in the way adults sometimes panic, loudly, uselessly, running in different directions. And then a volunteer paramedic who happened to be passing by walked into the chaos with a calmness that seemed almost supernatural. His voice was steady, his hands knew exactly where to go. The certainty in his movements transformed the panic around him the way sunlight transforms a room, not dramatically, but completely. Within minutes, Noah's cousin was coughing and crying and breathing, and the afternoon resumed, and everyone said what a miracle it was. But Noah stayed very still for a long time afterward, watching the paramedic repack his bag. He couldn't explain the feeling that had settled in his chest. It wasn't exactly that he wanted to be that man someday. It was more that he had seen, for the first time, what knowledge looked like when it was needed most. He had seen what it meant to carry something inside you that could walk into the worst moment of someone else's life and change it. From that day forward, Noah read everything he could find. He picked up discarded medical pamphlets from clinic waiting rooms. He borrowed old textbooks from library sales. He sat in the back of free first aid workshops offered at community shelters on Saturday mornings, taught by a retired firefighter named Marcus, who had a loud laugh and patient hands, and who never once made Noah feel like he didn't belong there. He studied under streetlights when the shelter closed early. He took notes in the margins of his handbook with a pencil stub he kept tucked behind his ear. Knowledge, he had decided, was the only thing life could not take away from him. That winter evening, colder than usual, he had been sitting outside a 24-hour grocery store eating a sandwich that the cashier, a kind woman named Mrs. Jenkins, had saved for him before closing time. He had been thinking about nothing in particular, just watching the rain fall and the cars pass, when he heard the screaming. A man burst out of a building across the street, sprinting toward a parked car with a small child bundled in a pink blanket pressed against his chest. The man's face was not the face of someone stressed or worried or upset. It was the face of someone standing at the very edge of something unbearable, staring down into it. Noah saw the child's arm hanging completely still, swinging with the motion of the man's running, and something in his body responded before his mind had fully processed what he was seeing. He ran. He ran across the street through the rain, following the car as it pulled away, running in the direction he had seen it heading, his torn sneakers slapping the wet pavement, his breath coming in clouds in the cold air. By the time he reached the emergency entrance of the hospital, he was completely soaked and breathing so hard his chest ached. The automatic doors were still sliding closed behind the man who had just rushed through them. Noah slipped inside before they shut. He followed the sound of voices and urgent footsteps down the corridor to the trauma room. He stopped in the doorway. He did not know he was going to stay. He just stopped, and then he didn't leave. He watched the medical team work. He watched the physician try technique after technique with the focused, exhausted precision of someone who has already given everything and is searching for something more to give. He watched the father against the wall, that man in the rain-soaked overcoat, and he recognized something in that man's face that he had seen before in his own, the specific expression of someone who has run out of places to put their hope. And then, in the middle of the silence after the doctor stepped back, Noah saw it. a movement so small it was almost nothing. One of Lily's fingers shifted slightly, a barely perceptible curl, and then her lips pressed together, a reflexive motion, the beginning of a cough that never quite arrived, a faint signal from somewhere inside her that something was still trying. Noah's mind went immediately to a page in his handbook, a specific airway technique, a recovery position that could open a partially obstructed airway by shifting the angle of the neck and jaw. He had read it so many times that it lived in his hands as much as in his head. He had practiced it in workshops with Marcus, had done it correctly even when his hands were shaking from nerves, had heard Marcus say quietly, "That's it. That's exactly it." And had felt the particular satisfaction of a body that knows what it's doing. Before fear could reason with him, he stepped forward into the room. Every head turned. The doctor looked at him with an expression that moved through confusion and irritation and arrived, somehow, at something else entirely. Perhaps because of the way Noah spoke, which was not loud, not demanding, not the voice of someone trying to impress anyone. "Please," Noah said. "Just give me 30 seconds." The room was frozen. The father stared at this small, soaking wet, barefoot boy with the duct-taped backpack, and something about what he saw, perhaps the steadiness in those young eyes, perhaps the same quality that had struck Noah about the paramedic all those years ago, that inexplicable certainty, stopped him from speaking. The doctor hesitated for a long moment, the kind of moment that stretches, the kind that everything depends on. Then he nodded once. Noah stepped to the bedside. He set down his backpack without looking at it. He placed his hands on Lily with the careful gentleness of someone who understood exactly how fragile the thing in front of him was, and he adjusted her position, lifting her chin slightly, tilting her head with a precision that came not from arrogance, but from practice. From 100 Saturday mornings in a shelter common room with Marcus walking between the rows saying, "Gentle, always gentle." You're asking the airway to open, not forcing it. 5 seconds. 10. 20. 30. Nothing. And then Lily coughed. It was weak, barely a sound, more like a small tremor passing through her tiny body. Then she coughed again, stronger. And then, like something breaking free from a great distance, she cried. It was a thin, furious, magnificent cry, the cry of a child who had been somewhere very far away and had just come back, and it filled that room so completely that for a moment, no one could speak or move or do anything except feel it happening. Then everything moved at once. Nurses surged forward, monitors flickered back to life. Someone was already on the phone, and Ethan Whitmore, the man who had built a company, who had never cried in a meeting, who had kept himself composed through every hard thing life had handed him, covered his face with both hands and folded forward in his chair, and wept the way you weep when something has been given back to you that you thought was gone forever. Noah picked up his backpack. He walked quietly toward the door. "Wait!" He turned. Ethan was crossing the room toward him, his face wet, his voice unsteady, and he stopped a few feet away and just looked at Noah for a moment, as though he was trying to understand something too large to fit into ordinary words. "Where are your parents?" he asked. Noah looked down at the floor. "My mom passed away 2 years ago," he said, "and my dad left before that." The hallway outside was quiet. Somewhere in the building, a cart rolled past. The fluorescent light above them hummed softly. Ethan took a breath. "What do you want more than anything?" Noah didn't hesitate. "I want to become a doctor." They stood there together, those two, in that corridor in the deep middle of the night, and for a moment the distance between them, all the money, all the years, all the circumstances simply didn't exist. There was only a father whose daughter was alive, and a boy who had made her so, and a question that had just been answered. "Then let's make sure you do," Ethan said. People called Noah a hero after that. His story spread. The barefoot boy, the duct-taped backpack, the 30 seconds that changed everything. But Noah was always uncomfortable with the word hero because he understood something that the headlines couldn't quite capture. He had not walked into that room alone. Marcus, the retired firefighter who gave up his Saturday mornings to teach first aid in a shelter common room, was in that room. Elena, the librarian who had quietly ignored overdue fines so Noah could keep borrowing medical books, was in that room. Mrs. Jenkins, who saved sandwiches before closing time so a hungry boy could keep walking and keep thinking and keep hoping, was in that room. Rosa, the shelter manager who let Noah stay inside on the coldest nights so he could read under the fluorescent lights instead of shivering on a bench somewhere, was in that room. None of them wore scrubs, none of them stood at that bedside, but every single one of them was there, folded into the movements of Noah's careful hands. Compassion had walked into that emergency room wearing a torn hoodie, and it had been built, piece by people who never expected to be remembered. 10 years later, a photograph hung on the wall of the pediatric wing of that same hospital. In it stood Dr. Noah Carter in a white coat that fit him properly now, his hair cut neatly, his eyes the same, still older than his face, still paying careful attention to everything. Beside him, grinning with the unself-conscious joy of an 11-year-old who has no reason not to grin, stood Lily Whitmore. Every year on the anniversary of that night, they met for breakfast at a small cafe near the hospital. Every year, Lily asked the same question, in the particular way children ask questions they already know the answer to, but want to hear again because the answer is important. Why did you stay when everyone else gave up? And every year, Noah looked at her, this girl who was alive because of a Tuesday morning in a shelter, because of a library book kept too long, because of a sandwich saved before closing time, because of everything small and quiet and unremarkable that had ever been done for him by people who simply decided to be kind. And he gave her the same answer. Because someone once stayed for me. Never judge a child by the condition of their clothes. Never assume that someone without a home has nothing to give. The book you donate, the lesson you teach, the extra 5 minutes you offer, the door you leave open. You may never know where these things end up. Kindness rarely arrives with applause. Sometimes it arrives soaked from the rain, carrying a broken backpack. And sometimes it stays when everyone else walks away.